The year is 1968, and the United States is at war in Vietnam. A Marine platoon is surrounded, trapped with no way out. They call for air support, but none are available. They beg for artillery, but the response is silence. Desperation sets in. Then, from over 25 miles away, a deep rumble shakes the air as the unthinkable happens. A massive, nearly forgotten war machine stirs to life. A relic from World War II. WWII, the USS New Jersey, an iron behemoth of the past, its colossal 16-inch guns now primed and ready to answer the call. This was no ordinary warship. This was a T-Rex of the seas, its guns capable of firing projectiles the size of a small car. And as its shells rained down on the enemy below, the game of warfare in Vietnam would never be the same. Before we dive deeper into the unimaginable firepower of the USS New Jersey, let me ask you a question. Where are you watching this story from? Maybe you're in New York, Los Angeles, or somewhere in between? Leave your city in the comments below. I really want to know where this incredible history is reaching. And while you're there, hit that like button if the power of the USS New Jersey's guns is blowing your mind. Show the YouTube algorithm that you want more military history stories like this one. And if you're not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? We've got amazing stories coming your way, from iconic battles to forgotten war machines that changed everything. Subscribe now and hit the notification bell so you never miss a video. Now, let's get back to this story, because what happened when the USS New Jersey entered Vietnam is about to blow your mind. In April 1968, a decision was made that would alter the course of the Vietnam War. The USS New Jersey, a battleship that had been decommissioned for nearly 2 decades, was brought back into service. But this wasn't just any ship. This was a massive, floating fortress from World War II, a relic of a bygone era that had been left to rust in the Naval Reserve Fleet. In the late 60s, with the war in Vietnam escalating, the United States needed a new way to support its ground troops without risking more pilots. The bombing campaigns were proving increasingly costly, with aircraft losses rising daily due to the dense air defense systems the North Vietnamese had put in place. Pilots were getting killed, and the bombing runs were achieving limited success. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara needed a solution. His answer was simple: bring back the New Jersey. At first, many in the modern Navy scoffed at the idea of reactivating a ship that many considered obsolete. The New Jersey had not seen combat since the Korean War, and many saw it as a relic of the past, unsuitable for the modern battlefield. The technology of the time had shifted. Supersonic jets, guided missiles, and helicopter air support had become the dominant forces in combat. To some, the idea of sending a WWII-era battleship into the jungles of Vietnam seemed absurd. But McNamara knew one thing that many others didn't. The New Jersey had firepower like no other ship on the planet. The New Jersey's most significant feature was its guns, 9 16-inch Mark VII guns, capable of firing shells weighing nearly 2,700 pounds each, as far as 25 miles. These shells, with a range longer than the reach of most modern artillery, could obliterate enemy positions with a single shot. And these were no ordinary shells. Some were designed to be armor-piercing, capable of tearing through thick concrete bunkers with ease. Others were high-explosive, capable of turning dense jungles into smoldering craters. But what made the New Jersey truly special was its armor. Nearly 20 inches of steel armor protected the ship's vital components, making it virtually invulnerable to anything short of a direct hit by a torpedo or an airstrike. This level of protection was unheard of in the modern Navy, where lighter, faster ships were favored for their agility. The New Jersey, on the other hand, was a powerhouse, a relic from an age when ships were built to withstand direct hits and keep fighting. When the New Jersey arrived in Vietnam, it was nothing short of a spectacle. The ship was the only battleship still in active service, and its sheer size was awe-inspiring. At over 900 feet long and weighing more than 45,000 tons, it dwarfed the other ships in the fleet. As it approached the coast of Vietnam, its guns came to life, ready to support the ground troops who were fighting in the dense jungles and on the hillsides. In the first few weeks, the New Jersey's presence was already making a significant impact. Ground troops, who had been pinned down by enemy fire, suddenly had the power of a floating fortress on their side. The USS New Jersey could fire in support of these troops from over 25 miles away, delivering pinpoint strikes that would decimate enemy positions. The Marines on the ground began to refer to the ship as their guardian angel. When they called for fire support, it was the deep rumble of the New Jersey's guns that answered. One of the first times the New Jersey fired in support of ground troops, the result was astonishing. A Marine platoon had become trapped in a valley, surrounded by enemy forces on all sides. With no way to escape, they called for artillery support. The New Jersey, positioned off the coast, received the coordinates and immediately began firing. Each shell that left the New Jersey's guns was like a thunderclap, and the results were devastating. Within minutes, the enemy forces were destroyed, and the Marines were able to extract safely. It was a victory that would not have been possible without the overwhelming firepower of the New Jersey. But the USS New Jersey wasn't just a symbol of raw power. It was also an example of cutting-edge precision. The battleship's fire control system, which had been updated during its modernization process, was capable of calculating incredibly precise firing solutions. The Mark VIII analog computer, which took up an entire room below deck, was constantly solving complex ballistic equations, taking into account factors such as wind speed, air density, and even the curvature of the Earth. It was an intricate dance of engineering and human skill, one that allowed the New Jersey to strike targets from over 20 miles away with remarkable accuracy. Once the USS New Jersey settled into its firing positions off the Vietnamese coast, the reality of what had been unleashed became impossible to ignore. This was not symbolic firepower. This was sustained, industrial-scale destruction delivered with mechanical precision. Every time one of the ship's massive turrets rotated, it felt like the laws of modern warfare were being bent backward. Steel gears groaned. Hydraulic systems hissed. Then came the blast. A single 16-inch gun firing released more energy than most artillery units could deliver in an entire barrage. The shockwave rolled across the sea, rattling equipment miles away and making even seasoned sailors instinctively brace themselves. Each shell weighed up to 2,700 pounds, packed with hundreds of pounds of high explosive. Once fired, it left the barrel at nearly 2,500 feet per second, climbing into the upper atmosphere before arcing back toward the target. For troops on the ground, the experience was surreal. Because the shells traveled faster than sound, the explosion arrived first. Only afterward did the sound hit, a tearing, ripping roar that veterans would later describe as a freight train screaming through the sky. It was disorienting, terrifying, and unmistakable. For American ground forces pinned down by entrenched enemy positions, this kind of fire support was something entirely new. Airstrikes could be delayed, aborted by weather, or blocked by anti-aircraft fire. Traditional artillery had limited range and mobility. The New Jersey changed that equation completely. Sitting safely beyond the horizon, it could reach targets more than 20 miles inland, smashing bunkers, cave complexes, and supply routes that had previously been untouchable. Enemy units that believed they were protected by distance suddenly found themselves exposed. What made this even more lethal was accuracy. Raw power alone would have been useless without control, and the New Jersey had both. Deep inside the ship, far below the main deck, sailors worked inside the main battery plotting room. This space was the ship's brain. At its center sat the Mark VIII Rangekeeper, an analog fire control computer made of thousands of gears, cams, and rotating shafts. It constantly calculated firing solutions in real time. Ship speed, course, wind direction, air density, powder temperature. Even the rotation of the Earth was factored into the equation. At extreme ranges, failing to account for the Coriolis effect could cause a miss by hundreds of yards. Forward observers on the ground played a crucial role. Marines and Army units relayed coordinates by radio, adjusting fire with calm, clipped instructions. Left 50. Add 100. The corrections were fed into the system. The turrets shifted by fractions of a degree, and another round was sent screaming toward the target. 90 seconds later, the observer would respond, sometimes with confirmation, sometimes with stunned silence. In several documented cases, targets simply ceased to exist. Hilltops collapsed. Tree lines vanished. Entire enemy strongpoints were erased in a single corrected shot. The psychological effect was devastating. Enemy fighters had faced bombs and artillery before, but this was different. There was no warning, no visible aircraft, no buildup. Just sudden annihilation from an invisible source beyond the horizon. North Vietnamese forces began referring to the ship as the Black Dragon, a creature that struck without being seen and could not be reached or destroyed. Morale suffered badly. Units abandoned fortified positions at the mere rumor that the battleship was on station nearby. Night operations amplified the terror. When the New Jersey fired after dark, the muzzle flash lit the horizon like lightning. For a split second, the ocean glowed white. On land, soldiers watched the sky tear open as shells descended from above, their paths marked only by faint, fast-moving streaks before impact. The jungle burned. The ground shook. Silence followed. Then the radio crackled again with another call for fire. By the end of its first weeks on the gun line, one truth was undeniable. The USS New Jersey was not obsolete. It was not outdated. It was a weapon perfectly suited for a specific, brutal purpose. In a war defined by ambushes, uncertainty, and attrition, the battleship delivered something rare: absolute certainty. When it fired, the outcome was never in doubt. As weeks turned into months, the presence of the battleship offshore began to reshape the rhythm of combat along the coast of Vietnam. This was no longer just fire support. It became a strategic instrument that commanders could plan around. Operations were timed to coincide with its availability. Assaults were launched knowing that, if everything went wrong, there was an answer waiting beyond the horizon. A deep, metallic answer that could arrive in minutes and change the outcome instantly. The ship operated almost non-stop. Day after day, fire missions came in, sometimes dozens in a single shift. Crews worked around the clock, sweating inside steel compartments thick with heat, noise, and the smell of propellant. Each turret required a perfectly synchronized ballet of men and machinery. Powder bags weighing over 100 pounds were hoisted into place. Shells taller than a man were rammed into the breech. The gun captain called the commands. The breech slammed shut. A split second of silence. Then the world recoiled. The physical strain on the ship was immense. Every full broadside released forces so violent that the hull flexed. Instruments rattled. Deck plates vibrated underfoot. Sailors not accustomed to the main guns firing were warned to brace themselves or risk being thrown off balance. Even miles away, smaller vessels could feel the concussion roll through the water. This was firepower on a scale that modern naval warfare had almost forgotten. Yet, despite this brutality, the system proved remarkably reliable. Mechanical failures were rare. Misfires were nearly non-existent. The guns, designed in the 1930s and refined during World War II, performed exactly as their engineers had intended. This reliability became critical in Vietnam, where weather often grounded aircraft and rough terrain limited artillery placement. When everything else failed, the battleship did not. The effects on enemy logistics were severe. Supply routes once considered safe, due to distance from the coast, were suddenly vulnerable. Ammunition depots, truck parks, and staging areas were destroyed before they could be dispersed. Hardened bunkers carved into hillsides, designed to withstand air attacks, were crushed by sheer kinetic force. A 16-inch shell didn't need perfect accuracy. Near misses alone were often enough. Shockwaves collapsed tunnels. Overpressure killed occupants instantly. Survivors fled positions they had spent months fortifying. But perhaps the most profound impact was psychological. The uncertainty was crushing. Enemy forces never knew when the next strike would come. There was no sound of approaching aircraft. No warning sirens, just sudden obliteration. Veterans later recalled the fear of knowing that an unseen weapon could erase them at any moment, without recourse or retaliation. The ship could not be reached. It could not be ambushed. It could not be silenced. American troops felt the opposite. Confidence rose noticeably in units operating within range of the guns. Radio calls requesting fire support became more decisive, more aggressive. Commanders pushed forward, knowing they had an overwhelming advantage in reserve. Many Marines later said that simply hearing the words "fire mission approved" over the radio changed everything. It meant they would survive. It meant the enemy position was already finished, even if it didn't know it yet. One incident became legendary among forward observers. A single fortified structure on a ridgeline had resisted repeated attacks. Coordinates were sent. The first round landed short. Corrections followed calmly. Minor adjustments. A fractional change in elevation. Another shot was fired. When the observer came back on the radio, his voice was stunned. He didn't confirm destruction. He simply said the ridgeline was gone. The target no longer existed as a physical feature. This ability to reshape terrain at will was unprecedented. It blurred the line between tactical support and strategic dominance. Hills could be flattened, forests cleared instantly. Enemy plans collapsed before they could be executed. All of it delivered by a machine many had dismissed as a relic. By late 1968, one fact was clear. This was not nostalgia. This was not desperation. It was adaptation. The United States had taken an old weapon and placed it into a new war with devastating effect. The so-called T-Rex was not lumbering or slow. It was precise, relentless, and terrifyingly effective. Behind the overwhelming destruction, there was a quieter story unfolding inside the ship itself. A story of human endurance, discipline, and precision under relentless operational tempo. The New Jersey was not firing occasionally. It was firing constantly. Crews slept in short rotations, ate quickly, and returned to their stations knowing another mission was already coming. Fatigue was real. The heat inside the ship was oppressive. Steel bulkheads trapped warmth, and the vibration from repeated firings never truly stopped. Yet performance never slipped. The men who operated the main battery were not pressing buttons on digital screens. They were turning wheels, aligning mechanical indicators, and trusting systems built decades earlier. Every calculation depended on coordination between sailors who had memorized procedures down to muscle memory. A single mistake could send a shell hundreds of yards off target. In combat conditions, that margin didn't exist. The ship demanded perfection, and the crew delivered it again and again. Communication between ship and shore became a lifeline. Forward observers learned to trust the battleship completely. They didn't request barrages lightly. When they called, it meant lives were hanging in the balance. The exchange was brief, professional, and deadly efficient. Coordinates transmitted. Confirmation received. Seconds later, the guns spoke. No hesitation. No debate. The process became so reliable that some units adjusted their entire operational doctrine around it. Enemy forces adapted as well, but their options were limited. Dispersal helped only slightly. Movement became riskier. Static defenses became liabilities instead of strengths. Any position that stayed occupied too long risked annihilation. Even when no shells fell, the threat alone altered behavior. Troops avoided certain areas altogether. Supply convoys moved only at night and under heavy camouflage, and even then, they weren't safe. The battleship's presence also forced higher-level strategic reconsideration. Naval planners who had once dismissed big-gun ships now had to confront an uncomfortable truth. In this environment, missiles were expensive. Aircraft were vulnerable. But a heavily armored platform firing massive conventional shells delivered unmatched cost-effectiveness and reliability. Every shell was devastating. Every mission was decisive. The numbers spoke for themselves. The tempo accelerated. By early 1969, the ship had fired more 16-inch shells in Vietnam than it had during entire previous wars. Thousands of rounds. Tens of thousands of tons of steel and explosive hurled inland. The wear on the guns became a concern. Barrels eroded. Maintenance crews worked constantly, measuring tolerances, replacing components, and keeping the system operational. Even at this pace, the guns performed within specification. What made this period unique was the contradiction at its core. The most advanced guerrilla war of the Cold War era was being shaped by a weapon conceived before radar-guided missiles, before jet engines, before computers. Yet the results were undeniable. The battlefield responded not to novelty, but to dominance. And dominance was exactly what the New Jersey delivered. For the sailors aboard, there was a growing awareness that they were part of something unusual. They weren't just supporting operations. They were redefining expectations. They were proving that raw mechanical power, when paired with training and discipline, could still overwhelm any opponent. Pride grew quietly. Not bravado, just certainty. For the troops on land, the battleship became something more than a weapon. It became a promise. A guarantee that no matter how isolated, no matter how desperate the situation, help could arrive from the sea with unstoppable force. That belief mattered. It kept units fighting. It kept men alive. By the time political winds began shifting back home, the verdict from the battlefield was already clear. The experiment had worked. The T-Rex had not only survived in a modern war, it had dominated its role, and the sound of its guns had rewritten the rules of fire support in Vietnam. As the months passed, the scale of what the battleship was accomplishing began to register beyond the tactical level. This was no longer just about saving pinned-down units or crushing isolated strongpoints. The presence of the New Jersey started to influence planning at every level of command. Operations near the coast were shaped with one question in mind: would the guns be available? If the answer was yes, commanders were willing to take risks they would never consider otherwise. The battleship delivered something air power could not always guarantee: persistence. Jets came and went. Helicopters had limits. Weather shut them down without warning. But the New Jersey stayed on station. Rain didn't matter. Clouds didn't matter. Darkness didn't matter. As long as the forward observers could see the target, or at least identify it on a map, the guns could reach it. This reliability turned the ship into a constant presence in the minds of both sides, even when it wasn't firing. Enemy commanders quickly learned that fixed positions were death traps. Bunkers that once felt secure became liabilities. Hills that offered commanding views became targets waiting to be erased. Even deeply buried positions weren't safe. The kinetic energy of a 16-inch shell was so immense that direct hits weren't required. Near misses collapsed tunnels, crushed entrances, and suffocated anyone inside. Survivability calculations changed overnight. There was also an economic reality at play. A single shell from the New Jersey cost a fraction of a modern airstrike. No pilots were exposed. No aircraft were lost. No recovery missions were needed. One ship, manned by a few thousand sailors, was delivering effects that previously required entire wings of aircraft. In an era of rising costs and political pressure, that mattered more than anyone was willing to say publicly. The psychological dimension deepened with every mission. Enemy units began to withdraw at the mere rumor that the battleship was operating nearby. Leaflets were dropped after bombardments, warning that more fire would follow if positions weren't abandoned. In several documented cases, that threat alone was enough. Fighters surrendered without another shot being fired. Fear had become a weapon, and it was being wielded with precision. Inside the ship, the crew felt the weight of responsibility. Every fire mission represented lives on the other end of the radio. Mistakes were unthinkable. The tempo never eased. Guns were inspected constantly. Fire control teams double-checked calculations. The process was mechanical, disciplined, and relentless. There was no room for emotion while the guns were firing. Only after the mission ended did the realization sink in of what had just been unleashed. By early 1969, the battleship had fired thousands of main battery rounds and tens of thousands of smaller caliber shells. The wear on the barrels was approaching operational limits. Each firing shaved microscopic layers of steel from the rifling. Eventually, the guns would need replacement. Everything about this operation was consuming resources at an extraordinary rate. And yet, from a battlefield perspective, the return on that investment was unquestionable. Then came the shift. Political priorities changed. Strategies evolved. The cost of maintaining such a massive platform began to outweigh its perceived necessity. Quietly, decisions were made far from the gun line. The battleship's mission was nearing its end, but the effects of its presence would linger long after the last shell was fired. When orders finally came to stand down, there was no ceremony, no final broadside. Just silence, where thunder had once rolled across the sea. For the sailors, it marked the end of an intense chapter few would ever experience again. For the troops on land, it meant losing a guardian that had never failed them. The T-Rex had done exactly what it was brought back to do. It had changed the game, not through novelty, but through overwhelming certainty. And once that certainty was removed, the war returned to its brutal, uncertain rhythm. By the spring of 1969, the thunder that had defined the battleship's presence in Vietnam began to fade. The USS New Jersey had delivered an unprecedented volume of firepower in an astonishingly short period of time. In just a few months on the gun line, it had fired more main battery shells than it had during its combined service in World War II and the Korean War. The numbers were staggering. Thousands of 16-inch rounds, nearly 15,000 5-inch shells, each one a calculated act of destruction, each one tied to a specific request from troops who needed immediate, overwhelming support. But war is never fought in isolation from politics. Back in Washington, priorities were shifting. The cost of operating the battleship was immense. Fuel consumption alone was extraordinary. Maintenance demands were constant. Every day at sea required a logistical chain that stretched across the Pacific. As pressure grew to reduce expenditures and alter strategy, the question was no longer whether the New Jersey was effective. That had already been proven beyond doubt. The question was whether the nation was willing to keep paying for it. In December 1969, the decision was made. The battleship would be decommissioned once again. For the second time in its career, the most powerful gun platform in the world was ordered into silence. The announcement was met with mixed reactions. Some saw it as inevitable. Others viewed it as a mistake. On the battlefield, the sentiment was far clearer. Ground troops who had relied on the ship felt the loss immediately. Something irreplaceable had been taken away. The final days on station were quiet. No dramatic farewell. No last display of force. The guns were secured. The decks were washed down. Sailors completed checklists they never expected to see again so soon. When the ship finally left the gun line, it did so without fanfare, fading back into history as quietly as it had returned. The legacy it left behind was impossible to ignore. Tactically, the battleship had proven that heavy naval gunfire could still dominate in a modern conflict. Strategically, it had forced military planners to reconsider assumptions about obsolescence. Technology does not become irrelevant simply because it is old. It becomes irrelevant only when something better replaces it. In Vietnam, nothing did. The psychological impact endured long after the ship's departure. Veterans on both sides remembered the sound, the suddenness, the helplessness. For those who faced it, the experience never faded. For those who were protected by it, the gratitude never diminished. The New Jersey had become more than steel and guns. It had become a symbol of certainty in a war defined by uncertainty. Years later, the ship would be reactivated yet again, this time into an era of missiles and electronics. But none of those later chapters carried the same weight. Vietnam was different. Vietnam was the moment when a weapon from the past stepped into the future and dominated it. When a supposed relic became a solution, no modern system could match. In the end, the battleship's time in Vietnam did not decide the war's outcome. It could not. No single weapon ever does. But in human terms, its impact was immeasurable. It saved lives. It broke enemy positions. It altered the psychology of the battlefield. And it proved that raw, controlled power still had a place, even in the age of high technology. The T-Rex had arrived as an experiment. It left as a legend. A reminder that sometimes the most terrifying answer to a modern problem is a weapon forged for an earlier age and wielded with absolute precision. What ultimately set this chapter apart was not just the scale of destruction, but the clarity it brought to a chaotic war. Vietnam was a conflict defined by ambiguity, invisible enemies, shifting front lines, victories that rarely felt final. In that environment, the battleship offered something almost unheard of: finality. When the guns fired, there was no debate about the result. Positions ceased to exist. Engagements ended immediately. The uncertainty that haunted so many operations vanished in a single violent moment. For commanders, this created a rare sense of control. Plans could be executed with confidence. Maneuvers that would normally be reckless became viable. Units advanced knowing that, if resistance hardened beyond expectation, a single radio call could change everything. That confidence didn't come from hope. It came from experience. Again and again, the New Jersey delivered exactly what it promised. Nothing more, nothing less. This reliability contrasted sharply with the rest of the war. Aircraft missions were aborted. Artillery units ran low on ammunition. Intelligence failed. Weather intervened. But the battleship remained constant. It didn't care about clouds or darkness. It didn't need runways or refueling tracks through jungle terrain. It simply waited, steel hull steady against the waves, until the next set of coordinates arrived. The enemy learned to fear that consistency. Adaptation became increasingly difficult. Movement drew attention. Static defense invited annihilation. The safest option often became withdrawal. Entire areas were effectively denied not by constant bombardment, but by the threat alone. The presence of the ship reshaped behavior without firing a single round. That kind of influence was rare, and it was powerful. There was also a deeper lesson unfolding, one that extended beyond Vietnam. Military history often moves in cycles. New technologies promise to replace old ones entirely. Yet time and again, certain fundamentals endure. Range, accuracy, protection, reliability. The New Jersey embodied all four. Its armor allowed it to survive. Its guns allowed it to dominate. Its crew allowed it to perform under relentless pressure. Together, they formed a system that no single modern alternative could fully replace. Inside the ship, there was an understanding that this moment would not last. Everyone knew the battleship was living on borrowed time. Budgets would tighten. Strategies would evolve. Missiles would take center stage. But while it lasted, there was no doubt about its relevance. The men who served aboard knew they were witnessing the final pure expression of naval gun power, a closing chapter that would never be repeated in the same way. When historians later examined this period, many struggled with the contradiction. How could a weapon conceived before World War II outperform systems designed decades later? The answer was uncomfortable but simple. Effectiveness is not about age. It is about suitability. And in Vietnam, the battleship was perfectly suited to its role. The T-Rex metaphor was more than dramatic language. Like its prehistoric namesake, the battleship was not fast or subtle. It did not need to be. It dominated through overwhelming force and the absence of rivals capable of challenging it directly. Once unleashed, there was no counter. Only avoidance. Only fear. By the time the ship withdrew, it had already secured its place in history. Not as a curiosity, not as a mistake, but as proof that decisive power still mattered, that engineering built for endurance could outlast trends, and that sometimes the most effective answer to a modern battlefield is the one everyone else thought was finished. What happened off the coast of Vietnam was more than a tactical experiment. It was a reminder of who built these machines, who operated them, and who depended on them when everything else failed. The sailors who stood watch inside steel compartments. The gunners who trusted calculations measured in fractions of degrees. The observers on the ground who keyed their radios, knowing lives depended on the next 90 seconds. And the Marines and soldiers who heard that distant thunder and knew they were not alone. This story belongs to them, to the crews, the ships, the engineers, and the equipment that carried an impossible burden and delivered when it mattered most. The USS New Jersey did not fight for glory. It fought for survival. It fought for time. And it fought so others could go home. To every service member who stood in harm's way, past and present, this is a story of respect, of gratitude, and of a reminder that courage, discipline, and resolve are the true forces that change the game.